Contamination energy. This energy is toxic energy particles that clump together to form a grey cloud with a green tinge. It likes to enter the energy body and head straight into the physical body where it will find an organ or tissue to settle in. It's usually from someone else's toxic emotions being directed or dumped on you, or you take it on. Or it can be from an interaction with a demonic entity, as well as from having an interaction with a negative being in physical human form, such as the Changeling Collective, which we'll talk about later. The attaching mechanisms. Contaminational energy from people. So when it comes to contaminational energy from people, the attaching mechanism seems to be a weak energy body, weak emotional boundaries, or weak sense of self as far as toxic emotions being directed or dumped on you, or if you take it on. Contamination energy from negative forces. So when it comes to contamination from negative forces, the attaching mechanism is having an interaction with a demonic entity or with a negative being in physical human form, such as the Changeling Collective. Lack of discernment would be the energetic root cause of this interaction most of the time. As we move through this massive awakening in this evolutionary cycle we're in, we are going to be forced to face the truth of the reality behind the illusion we have bought into. The invisible is becoming visible, and we're reaching the stage where we're being forced to listen to our body wisdom for discernment in order to navigate properly. Without fine-tuned discernment, we will find it hard to navigate and stay clear. So the inner work and body connection work is vital. So start now if you're not already in a deeply intimate relationship with yourself. So contamination energy is basically either when we've taken on someone else's toxic emotional energy, it's either been dumped or projected onto us, and we've allowed it in, or we've been around, someone with toxic emotional energy, and as an empath, sometimes even if the person's not directing it or dumping it on us or projecting it onto us, sometimes just as an empath being around someone like this, we actually take it on and absorb someone else's toxic emotional stuff, which turns into contamination energy. Now, the other way that contamination energy can happen is if we've had an interaction with either a demonic entity, or if we've had an interaction with a negative being, such as, a negative being, or some sort of negative incarnated being like a changeling, which we're going to go into a bit later. So basically, if we've been around any sort of negative entity or a negative being, then we can get contamination energy. And the other way to get it is through other people's toxic emotional energy being projected or dumped on us, or we absorb in and allow in. Now, when it comes to people and taking on their toxic emotional energy, which then becomes contamination energy in our system, this happens, when we don't have a strong sense of self, when we don't have a strong sense of boundaries within our own self. And most empaths find this very, very hard, because the natural empathic gift is to feel into others, to really feel the other person's experience. Now, if you're an extreme empath who can feel other people's experiences, it's very hard not to take them on. And this is where I find a lot of empaths that don't have good, strong self-love and boundaries can end up really, really toxic. Now, I've worked for people who have been so sick, and it's because they just take on so much of other people's stuff. Now, a lot of that showed up as contamination energy, and it also shows up with, huge amounts of compassionate connections and stuff like that. So it's very interesting that being an empath is absolutely an amazing gift. But if you don't have the self-love, and you don't have the self-love creates good, strong energetic boundaries, and without that, the empathic gift can, feel like a curse, because you're just consumed with everybody's shit. So an empath, with really good self-love and really good self-boundaries and, really good discernment and really good integrity, an empath in that state is an absolute gift to this planet, an absolute gift to this planet. But an empath with no self-love and no energetic boundaries becomes somebody who is, deactivated and not activated. So they don't end up, doing what they came here to do. So it's really important that, obviously the people who are drawn to my type of work are empathic people, people who feel energy more than others. And I'm really, really kind of just trying to instill, if you're not somebody who has a really deep sense of self and really deep sense of self-love, then it's something that I would definitely highly encourage you to be put first on your list. Because if there's one thing that can help so much, it's self-love. The more you love and value yourself, the more you put your own oxygen mask on before you put someone else's oxygen mask on, the more valuable you become in the world. And that is just how it goes. And that, is like the most important analogy for someone to remember. When you're on a plane, they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on before you even help your child. Now, when I first heard that as a mother, it kind of freaked my brain out a bit, because it was like, what? Like, I would never do that. When I first flew with my daughter as a newborn, well, she wasn't newborn, but as a young baby, and I was sitting there with her on my lap, and the hostess was going through the safety stuff, and I'd heard this before, but it didn't really kind of, hit me emotionally until I'd become a mother for the first time. So when I heard the hostess say, to put your own oxygen mask on if needed before you help anyone else and your children, there was a part of me that kind of rejected that and almost felt like, oh my God, I would never do that. Of course I would put my child's oxygen mask on before my own. And it was a really interesting process that brought up in me, because I could feel my higher self sort of saying to me, how is that going to serve anybody? Like, how is that going to work? Like, how would that benefit, my daughter, if I put hers on before myself and then I wasn't able to breathe? Like, that would not be helpful. So of course, putting my own oxygen mask on first allows me to be in the right state to then help my daughter and anyone else that I could, if we were in that position where we needed to put oxygen mask on and something was going on, the plane was going down or something. Now, a pretty morbid thing to think about when you're flying with your little girl for the first time and this comes up, but I spent the whole trip, really, really going deep on that, because I felt resistance in looking after myself first, because, especially if you're a mom, you would know there's a part of you that's like, oh no, I would put my child before myself any day. And that was the part that made me realize that was my big bells, the bells rang that day. And I realized that this thought process that I had was based on look after everybody else before myself. That was the way that I was living my life. I would do things for other people to help them that I wouldn't even do for myself to help my own life. And there was the twisty parts that I started to recognize. So I highly encourage you to feel into that. Are you somebody that would struggle to put your own oxygen mask on first before putting on your child or someone else's oxygen mask? Or does that feel quite natural for you to do? Because that's a very good gauge of where you are in your self-love and where you are as far as, do you help others before you take care of yourself? Because that is something that allows a lot of different attachments, and contamination energy, that's just like an open door to it. And like I said, in this stage of evolution that we're in, we're going through this massive shift in evolution. And part of that shift is us learning to trust our body wisdom, because like I've said many times, your body is the GPS. Your body knows the way. Your body knows the way to your highest version of yourself. That is your GPS. Discernment is through that GPS in your body. The more you tune in to your body, the more you have a relationship with yourself and your inner world and your body, the more discernment you have, and the easier it is to navigate. So I highly recommend, really thinking about this, really tuning in to where you are at in your self-love and your self-care and your energetic boundaries. Do you take care of yourself before helping others? Because we've been conditioned to think that is selfish, but the word selfish is actually to have a sense of self. Now, as women especially, we've been conditioned that if you look after yourself first, that you're selfish. Now, if that's the case, then I think we all need to stand up and start claiming and being okay with being selfish first, because when you know that you have to take care of yourself first before helping others, it allows your energy body to become very strong, very grounded, and that is going to help you navigate and be discerning and have an awesome life. It's not through sacrificing what you need in order to help others. That is basically going to give you, get you spinning your wheels for a whole lifetime in the same spot. And that is literally not why you came here. You came here to help with this massive awakening. You came here to be that beacon of light. You came here to express yourself in a human form, your divine self in human form. Now, what that looks like to each person is really, really different and unique. But when you're living your purpose and when you're not. So if you don't feel like you are genuinely living your purpose, then the chances are it's the lack of self-love that has been allowing you to spin your wheels. Now, if you are living your purpose, if you feel like you are in alignment to your purpose, but you might not be fully living into the highest version of yourself in that purpose, then I would also say that it comes down to the fine-tuning of the self-love and self-care, because once we really, really get to that space, that deep self-love and self-care, then you'll find the natural result of that is being really discerning and really moving forward towards your highest version of yourself and your highest dreaming, because that is what honoring yourself is. When you honor yourself first and you have that relationship with yourself, you will naturally be guided and motivated to step into the highest, most expansive version of yourself. The results in a person. Usually the person will feel very low vibrationally and have more negatively charged mind and emotional grid than usual. It can cause headaches, skin rashes, dehydration, hard stomach and constipation, foggy head. They're just to name a few. Contamination energy can range in toxicity, and obviously the more toxic the contamination energy is, then the more severe the results will show up for the person. So let's have a look at what a mild amount of contaminational energy would look like. So when someone has a mild amount of contaminational energy, it would probably show up in a reading, for example, when someone has a partner or a parent who acts like a child, who quite regularly has a temper tantrum and blames others and yells and carries on and projects those emotions onto others. So when it comes to, a mild sort of case of contamination energy, what regularly shows up, in the people that I see, usually when I get a mild case of contamination energy, it's usually based on the person either having a parent or a partner, sometimes even a child, who regularly has temper tantrums and projects their toxic emotions out and projects onto others. So this is a really common thing that I pick up. Most times when I'm doing work for somebody, it's very unusual if I don't find some type of contaminational energy when I'm finding things like hooks and cords and compassionate connections. So I'm not saying that everybody that you read for is going to have compassion, contamination, or energy, but I am saying that when you get certain clients who are more prone to hooks and cords and compassionate connections, then they're usually the people that contamination or energy will also scan up as, because they're usually the people who have really, a low sense of self and take on other people's stuff easier. So, like I said, a mild case of contamination or energy would show up if somebody lives with a partner or a parent or a child. And children, I'll talk about that in a moment, but just say that you have one of these, or a close friend or even a boss. Bosses can sometimes do this too. You're around someone who's not able to handle their emotions, and when they start to build up like a volcano and they erupt, if they're someone who just blames others and dumps their shit on people and projects and blames, and you have a partner or a boss or a parent who's like that, chances are, unless you have a really strong sense of self, and if you had a really strong sense of self, then you wouldn't be in a relationship or a close relationship with someone like that, would you? I mean, think about it. If you have a really strong sense of self and, you love yourself deeply, then you would not allow yourself to be around someone regularly who does this. It just wouldn't happen. So when you haven't got a strong sense of self, you allow yourself to be in situations that someone with a strong sense of self and self-love would never allow themselves to be subjected to. So, this is kind of the thing that happens. And so the person who gets projected and dumped on, takes on that stuff, and they have, contamination or energy, and it will show up as a mild case. Because the person who they're around who keeps dumping their stuff, even though the person might be really angry and explode and do all that kind of carry on, it will still kind of be a mild case because the person is still operating and still choosing to be around that person. And, obviously if the person is dumping a lot of contamination energy onto the person, or dumping toxic emotional energy onto the person, which then gets taken on as contamination energy. If the person's subjected to that daily, then it would become a more extreme case. But if they're around someone who does this, maybe once or twice a month, they have a meltdown and an explosion, then it would show up as a mild case. If this was happening daily, it would definitely show up as a more extreme case, because the person would definitely be taking in a huge amount of toxic emotional energy, and therefore it would then turn into contamination energy in their body, and there's only so much contamination energy the body can handle before health starts deteriorating really, really fast. So when it comes to children, I just want to quickly say that not every child who throws a tantrum is expressing toxic emotional energy. Sometimes children are more in the moment, and when you're in the moment and you're expressing in the moment, then you're actually connected to yourself, and projection's harder to happen. So children normally just crack the shits like totally in the moment. They're totally present in their body and they're feeling energy. Emotions are energy and emotion. They'll feel energy come through. It might be triggered by something, but they feel the energy, they express the energy, and they're usually in the moment. So toxic emotional energy from a child is, less likely than an adult, because children are usually expressing in the moment. And the transference of energy is very different when someone's in the moment and in their body. It's less likely to project. So I find with children, that toxic emotional energy is less common, even though young children throw lots of temper tantrums, and I have an 11-year-old who still can throw them, and sometimes it's some toxic emotions that coming out, and other times it doesn't come out as toxic emotional energy, because you know, she's in the moment and she's just expressing energy and there's no projection there. So it does depend. So don't think that every time a child has a temper tantrum that they're throwing toxic emotional energy around and that you might pick it up as contaminational energy. That's not the case. But it does mean the more self-love and emotional security and boundaries we have as mothers, the less likely we are to take on contaminational energy from our children, as well as our partners and loved ones as well. So let's have a look at an extreme amount of contaminational energy. So when it comes to an extreme amount of contaminational energy, it would show up in a reading, for example, when someone is in a very toxic, physically, emotionally, or mentally abusive relationship of any kind, where they are constantly projected upon while being abused. So when it comes to extreme amount of contaminational energy, what I normally find, the cases that I have that are extreme amount, is basically, as you can imagine, a really abusive relationship. So somebody is being physically, mentally, or emotionally abused and at an extreme level, then the person taking that abuse will be taking on all of that person's toxic emotions, and it will then turn into contaminational energy within them. And the person taking the abuse is going to become more and more weak as time goes on. Contamination energy, the more you take on, the more weak you are in yourself, the more you lose a sense of self. So someone who's consistently taking emotional, mental, or physical abuse is definitely going to have a huge extreme amount of contaminational energy, because it's just so regular and it's so, you know, extreme that the person is going to have no choice but to have an energy body full of contaminational energy. So if you have clients that you're reading for and they have an extreme amount of contaminational energy, trying to help the person recognize that the position that they're in, it's not going to get better for them. It's going to get worse, and their body will not be able to continue coping with that much toxicity. So it's really important for them to be aware that every time they choose to take that on and to be that person's scapegoat, they're actually losing, each time they're losing more and more of themselves, and that is definitely not, you know, going to lead them to a great life. But in saying that, it's a very delicate sort of position to be in when you're working with someone with this such a high level of contaminational energy, because the chances are that when you're speaking to someone with a huge amount of contaminational energy, they literally do not see that they are strong enough to walk away from that abuse, basically. It's very, very difficult. It's almost like they need to clean themselves up first energetically in order to feel a sense of self, in order to make a better decision. So when you have clients come in with this sort of thing going on, and you do find that it's extreme, please don't overly invest in trying to help them out of that situation, because a lot of the time you'll find that it can take years for someone to leave an unhealthy relationship, because they are just so disabled and buckled in their own sense of self that they would rather be in the abuse because they feel like they need the support, even if it's extremely toxic, rather than be on their own. So, you know, the best advice is to just do a clearing, explain what contaminational energy is so they have the awareness, but remember that they still have to make the choice. So cleaning it up allows them to find and connect with themselves, you know, in a better way and a more deeper and more stronger way. And hopefully that's enough for them to start taking less contaminational energy on or making better choices. But please don't be surprised or over-invested if the person goes back to the same thing, because 9 times out of 10, the person will, because it comes down to self-love and self-respect, and that takes a lot more work than just clearing this energy. It's a commitment to themselves, and a lot of people aren't willing to make that commitment, and we cannot take that commitment on for them. It's really important to remember that. So now let's have a look at contaminational energy from negative forces, because this is definitely more toxic. So contaminational energy from an interaction with a demonic entity, or having an interaction with a negative being in physical human form, such as the changeling collective, will be darker in color and more toxic in its interaction with our body. This type of contaminational energy likes to sit in the spinal column and affects the central nervous system of the person, and can be so toxic it can have someone in hospital very quickly with serious autoimmune dysfunctions, or it can take its time and slowly create issues in the central nervous system. So when it comes to negative forces, like having an interaction with a demonic entity, or having this type of, having a negative being, a negative soul in human form, like I said, like a changeling collective or just a negative soul, if we have someone like that projecting their toxic emotional energies onto us, the contamination energy that we take on is going to be extremely more toxic. So when it comes to having an interaction with a demonic entity, obviously if a demonic entity is attached to us, and you know, we've gone over the different types of entities, there are some that are more toxic and more full-on than others. They can leave a lot of contaminational energy behind. So, you know, those types of interactions obviously leave, you know, contaminational energy in our body. They are toxic. But when it comes to having an interaction with someone in a physical form who's a negative being or a negative soul, someone like the Changeling Collective, this energy is just so toxic that it literally just heads straight for the central nervous system. It heads straight for the, well, I should say the spinal column, and it makes its way into the central nervous system. Now, it depends on the interaction with the negative being or the Changeling Collective. So it depends on your interaction with them and how much it's still, they still need to, you know, be exploding toxic emotional energy onto you. Although being around them, just being around them, your energy body, if you're not strong, still can take on a little bit just by being around them, because they are toxic. So just being around them, if you are very weak within your own sense of self, then just being around one, you'd take on a little bit, but not, you know, a huge amount to worry about, but you would take on a little bit. So if they get angry at you and project some toxic emotional energy onto you, this is the energy that just comes in really fast. It's almost like there's very little chance, once it's kind of start to penetrate, it's very little chance of getting, you know, putting the walls up for it, because it's just so fast and so strong. So once it enters, it's very, very fast, heads straight for the spinal column, gets into the central nervous system, and can really buckle someone quite quickly. Now, if the interaction, if the toxic emotional energy isn't that strong, if the person's not spewing, you know, a huge amount of toxic emotional energy onto you, then the chances are, you know, and it's a mild case, and the chances are that that contaminational energy will start to affect the central nervous system in a slower way. But the person, over a space of a few weeks or a month, will start to have weird symptoms showing up, you know, based around their central nervous system and their autoimmune sort of functioning. But if it's an extreme amount, it will buckle them quite quickly, and things will just start showing up straight away. So it does depend on the amount of toxic emotional energy charge that the person's, like, you know, dumping on you, which will depend on how quickly, if it's a negative soul, how quickly that toxic emotional energy will turn into contaminational energy and head for the central nervous system. Now, if the toxic emotional energy is coming from a positive being, you know, or so you've been around a positive person who's been projecting the toxic emotional energy onto you, then the contaminational energy, once it's in your body and it turns into the contaminational energy, then that energy likes to head straight for the cell, like the organs and the cells. So toxic emotional energy from a positive soul being projected onto you, and then your body takes it on as contaminational energy, it will go into certain organs. Usually, certain organs like to draw in contaminational energy. So someone might have contaminational energy all through their liver and kidneys. Someone might have it in their heart. It depends on the relationship with the person where it will start to store in the body. But when it comes to negative beings and negative forces, contaminational energy heads straight for the spinal cord and the central nervous system, and definitely affects the autoimmune response within a person and your central nervous system very, very quickly. Lifespan. Contamination energy is always a present life issue, and I don't think it could hide, but I'm actually not sure about this one. For now, I'm going to say it should always scan up if it's there, but I also have to say that it depends on your ability to do this work and pick up the fine details. And like I keep saying, that has to do with your shadow work and the cleaning up of your own wounds and your integrity. So when it comes to contaminational energy, it's always a present life issue. It's not a past life issue, it's always a present life issue. And I'm going to say that it can't hide, but in saying that, I do need to say that it does depend on your ability to read the records. So it depends on your integrity, your relationship with yourself, and your own shadow work. You've been doing a lot of shadow work, you know who you are, you've got a good sense of self, your integrity is strong. Then when you read in the records, you should definitely be able to pick up even the slightest bit of contamination energy. Obviously, if you're not as tightly attuned to your sense of self and your integrity, then you might not pick up the smaller contaminational energy or the lighter stuff. You might pick up just the extreme cases. So it depends on your ability, your relationship with yourself and your body wisdom depends on how much you pick up. But I am going to say that if anyone has an extreme sort of case of contamination energy, everyone should pick that up. But if someone has a small amount of contaminational energy, somebody who's not as deeply aligned to themselves as another person might not pick up the smaller contaminational energy. So that's just a fine detailed sort of thing, and that's just how it is. The more you read the records, the more you do your shadow work, the more you clear yourself, the more you fine-tune your integrity and your discernment, the more fine detail you're going to pick up in a reading. So I think this is just one of those things that, most of the time you're going to pick it up, but there might be some things that you won't pick up if you're not, in a tight alignment with yourself and your own sense of self. So like I said, two people could read for the same person, but one person may find more than the other based on the ability and integrity. Like I have said before, the information you get will be based on your integrity and your own inner healing. So contamination energy, all you have to remember is that contamination energy is toxic emotional energy from an incarnated soul who has been projected onto a person. The person's taken it on and it goes into the system and turns into contamination energy. It's not the same as toxic emotional energy. Toxic emotional energy, we're not just taking on the toxic emotional energy. When toxic emotional energy doesn't belong to you and you take it on, it actually turns into a different energy in your body. So that is why it's called contaminational energy and not toxic emotional energy. Now, it also can come from negative forces, like I said, and this becomes a more deadly form of contaminational energy that definitely doesn't just like to go into the organs and cells. It likes to head straight for the the central nervous system, like I said, and affecting the person's autoimmune responses and central nervous system. So, you know, both contamination energies, you know, definitely come into the body and head for different areas. And like I said, one is more powerful and definitely more disabling than the other.